Can people change their patterns of sexual attraction and behavior? This question is becoming more contested every day. New South Wales and Australia recently banned any efforts to change sexual orientation or gender identity, including prayer. Here in the United States, the Supreme Court has agreed to consider a challenge to a Colorado law that bans what it calls, quote, conversion therapy. Whatever answer you may give, the fact is that many men and women around the world, for a variety of reasons, passionately hope that the answer to this question is yes, changing sexual attractions and behavior is possible. Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Jennifer Roback Morse, founder and president of the Ruth Institute, an international interfaith coalition to defend the family and build a civilization of love. Well, can people make lasting changes in their patterns of sexual attraction and behavior? And how do these patterns form in the first place? Can therapists help? And if so, how? Today, I'm delighted to have a guest who can help us with these important questions. Dr. Floyd Godfrey is a clinical sexologist, board-certified Christian counselor, and a certified sex addiction specialist. He has over 20 years of experience helping people address pornography addiction, intimacy disorders, gender confusion, and unwanted sexualized attachments. Dr. Godfrey equips churches, therapists, families, and individual clients to navigate the complex intersections of sexuality, trauma, and spiritual identity. I know you're going to be fascinated by this conversation, and you'll want to share it with your friends. Dr. Floyd Godfrey, welcome to the Dr. J Show.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here.
Well, you and I met at a meeting of the International Foundation for Therapeutic and Counseling Choice over in Poland, and I was not familiar with you and your work. And I guess that's one of the virtues of a conference like that, is you meet people from different disciplines in different parts of the world and so on and so forth. But one of your main stage presentations was on the science of sex addiction. And I found that to be very fascinating. So we're going to start with that. First, tell us a little bit about your professional background, and then give us some of your highlights about how you view sex addiction and how you treat it.
Sure, you bet. Professional background, I was a licensed clinician for 23 years, working with people who had all kinds of sexual issues, working in social services for about 30 years. My degree is in psychology, professional counseling, and then I have a doctoral degree in sexology, clinical sexology. So I guess a little historical background. I went into the counseling field. I wanted to work with families and kids. I've always loved kids, and started working with children, doing play therapy and experiential techniques and whatnot. But of course, with my degree and my experience, I had several priests and some other religious leaders referring clients to me because they didn't know where else to send them. They knew I was faith-based and wanted to send clients who might have been struggling with a pornography addiction or a same-sex attraction or some sexual confusion piece. And of course, I knew a lot about that topic. And so I would have a lot of success with those clients. They would do quite well, and they would go back and tell their priest or their pastor. And before I knew it, that was my full-time caseload. So after a while, that's all I was doing was sexological issues. So 23 years of that. Then we developed a sexual addiction program at the office there. We've served about 1,600 clients, men, their wives, who have struggled with that, and developed a youth program and a young adult program. And so we've helped a lot of people. We have a lot of experience working with especially sexual addiction and what that looks like.
And so don't you have a degree in sexology?
I do. My doctoral degree is in human sexuality or clinical sexology.
Okay. And so when you describe the field of sexology, I have a vision of Alfred Kinsey or something, so why don't you just tell us a little bit, what does that field encompass? What does it mean to have a doctorate in that field?
Yeah, well, you're not too far off with that. The field is quite liberal. There's a lot of
Yeah.
liberal ideas in the field of sexology and the study. It's generally speaking the study of human sexuality. So we would be working with issues related to, for example, sexual abuse and victims of
Oh,
abuse. We'd be working with offenders and what dynamics create an offender profile. And you'd be working with people who are confused about their gender and have transgender sort of confusion. Or you'd be working with people who had a sexual addiction or compulsive sexual behaviors or so all aspects, sex therapy, sexual dysfunction, all aspects of human sexuality are really encompassed within the field of sexology.
okay. All right. And so that that gives us a range of it, and kind of how you. It sounds like you kind of backed your way into it. It wasn't really your plan at first. Counseling was your first love, and your
Mhm.
caseload just
Yeah, I
drove you
think
into it.
God sort of opened the doors and the floodgates opened and I was able to help people in that way and of course I have a love. I worked with so many, probably after a few hundred adults, men who had sexual addictions ranging from pornography to prostitution, all kinds of things. Story after story telling me, I wish I had more information when I was a teenager. I wish that when I was younger, somebody had stepped in to guide me. And so that really opened my interest as well in working with young men and teenagers who are struggling. If we can nip it in the bud before it becomes so out of control or so problematic. Yeah.
Hmm. Well, I have your book that you sent me, your workbook,
Oh,
and
yes.
at some point we're going to talk about this because this is the outgrowth of that work. It sounds like that's where this all came from. But
Yes, that was
it,
one aspect. Hmm.
yes, yes, yes. But I'd really like to start with sex addiction, though. Because the way you describe the process of sexual addiction, and then how that process, how that addictive process plays into a number of other things that have different labels, but that there's some commonality amongst a lot of these issues. So just give us the brief rundown on how you think about sexual addiction.
I would think of sexual addiction as an intimacy attachment disorder. So it's unlike any other addiction. You might think of alcohol addiction, or you might think of gambling addiction, problems like that. And of course, there's addictive components to it. The areas of the brain rewire, and so your prefrontal cortex will rewire, and it has some changes there. Dr. Amen has done some good scans on people who compulsively use pornography and how it rewires the brain and creates different symptoms for that. But generally speaking, there are going to be attachment issues related underneath to the addiction. So attachment wounds or attachment deficits, difficulties attaching. And that's one common thread that weaves through every sexual addict story. They had trouble connecting with their parents, or they had trouble connecting with their friends, or they had trouble connecting at work, or or disruptions where they had wounds. They might have been wounded in relationships, and so the sexual addiction really becomes a sideways effort of the brain to reconnect. It's trying, and attachment is wired into us by God. God wired us
Yes.
to be attached, to connect with one another,
Yeah.
and to bond. So when those bonds are disrupted, the brain is still seeking a way to connect. And pornography or sexual addiction happens to be a very toxic form of sort of, trying to connect, your brain trying to connect.
There's an attempt to do something good, but it's so twisted, it's so distorted that it, it,
Yeah.
it can't do the job. And so you just keep doing more of it, and then the addictive process kicks
Yeah.
in a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's interesting to me. Not long ago, I interviewed a psychiatrist, and she and I were talking about attachment. And honestly, Floyd, the first way that I got into all of this material on the family was way back when we adopted a little boy from a Romanian orphanage.
Ah.
And so, yeah, right, your eyes go out. You're like we had no idea what we were
Oh,
getting
yeah.
into in
Oh, yeah.
1991. And, I'm an economist, not a therapist. My
Mm,
husband's an engineer. We were
mm, mm,
not
mm, mm.
prepared at all, but we learned very quickly just how serious it was what had happened to him,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
just how fundamental it is what the mother does with the baby.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so this is not the time to talk about Mary Ainsworth and John Bowlby, unless
Mhm.
you want to. Unless you want to.
Well, it definitely applies. That was groundbreaking work. Ainsworth
Yes.
and Bowlby talking about how the need for attachment will drive a person to all kinds of places, because ultimately you have to bond. It's DNA. It's wired into you. It's God's design for you to bond. So yeah, it
Right.
was fantastic work.
Right. Right. You know, in the Bible it says it's not good for man to be alone.
Mhm.
My rewording of that is it's not even possible for the
Yeah.
man to be alone. And the baby, it's not
Mhm.
even possible for the baby to be alone. So it's a very fundamental reality. And so what
Mhm.
would be
Mhm.
what would be the kind of story that you would hear from somebody? When somebody comes into you, their presenting problem maybe is pornography addiction or sex addiction or something, and you talk with them for a while and you discover this attachment story. What kinds of stories would you hear from people that would be maybe typical or composite story?
Yes, well, there's always a range of stories, and the ways of disrupting attachment it can be a thousandfold. So I've heard stories from men and young men where they were sexually abused, and it caused such a reaction from them that they were afraid to connect. They don't know how to connect, or uh, they're afraid of romantic relationships because of abuse that occurred. I've also talked to men and young men who remember growing up and then were bullied. They never fit in. They never had a group of friends. They never had a place where they felt like they were just accepted for who they were. And sometimes even those stories, even they're even in church
Yeah.
communities or schools. Scouting places where kids are supposed to connect and they don't. That's another aspect of bonding we don't always recognize. We often think of bonding as with a person. And something I like that Dr. Clark said when I was doing my dissertation is that the need to belong is the greatest motivator of human behavior. And this need to belong in community, and it's almost like
Mhm.
a bonding factor that's communal. And in other countries where mothers and fathers are a little less involved and the community is more involved, African tribes, some of the African tribes, for example, the need to belong to the tribe is essential for survival. So
Mhm.
if you just pull that back and you look at U.S., Canadian cultures, North American cultures, kids need to belong in school. They need to have a place where they fit in, uh, families where they fit in, a church community where they fit in. So they need to belong. I've heard a lot of stories about feeling misfit, not feeling like they fit in there. Sometimes disruption in marriages where the husband, usually the addict is the husband, and he's struggling and doesn't know how to connect with his wife, can't connect with her well, and it starts to lead him in other places. And then you discover he never connected with women ever well. And
Mhm.
so it could be all kinds of stories, from ranging from abuse, manipulation, to not ever fitting in, to I've also heard stories of illnesses. A kid grows up and he or she is sick all the time, struggling, and so they don't have a chance to fit in. They don't have a chance to go play. They don't have or people are looking down on them and not bringing them into the group, or mom didn't want the child. Kids pick up on these things, and it
Mhm.
leaves them with a longing, an ever unsatiated need to connect, a
Mm.
hunger. Boys whose dad left, sometimes because he had to, Vietnam War, something like that, or because dad died, he was killed, or sometimes, in some cases, dad didn't even care. He didn't want kids. He didn't. In any case, the child feels that, and the longing persists, and the longing doesn't go away, and the longing is looking for resolution. And suddenly, you have, a teenage girl who dad didn't even want kids, and she's starved. She's like boy hungry, and she's all over the place
Yeah.
with all the boys. And so you can usually pin some of these compulsive behaviors back to emotional roots. And that's one thing that I like to teach the clinicians when I'm training them: the what people are attracted to in their compulsive behaviors, what they're looking at, who they're looking at, who they do things with in their fantasies. These are all related to emotional underpinnings. There's always an emotional foundation under there that created this sexual compulsion. So, what does it tell you? What is the fantasy telling you about the client and who they are and what they're struggling with? So, it's really ultimately sex addiction is an intimacy attachment disorder.
That's very interesting to me. And the meeting where we were was focused a lot on, but not exclusively on, people dealing with unwanted same-sex attraction and ways of assisting those people. But
Mm,
what was so interesting to me about your presentation is that you were looking not simply at that issue. That's one issue among many which
mm,
have a kind of common root. And I've noticed our friends, I don't know if you know this group of people, the people who are based in Kansas City, Desert Streams, Living
mm.
Waters, Andy
Yes.
Kaminsky and those guys. That's a 40
Oh,
year
yes.
long ministry.
Hmm.
And I, I thought that was a thing for people with same sex attraction. But he said, really, in their groups, it's about a third of the people who are
Mm,
dealing with same sex attraction. The others are dealing with pornography or sex addictions or these
mhm,
other things. So
mhm,
that's
mhm,
why I was so interested in your analysis.
mhm,
The way the modern psychology profession deals with these issues is not that. I mean,
mhm.
your way of looking at it is that there's a common thread with a lot of the sexual issues, but it doesn't have to do with people being born that way. Sexual orientation doesn't get you very far in understanding it, and the genetic part isn't that interesting. You're looking at something very different. Would you spend some time contrasting your approach with what I guess you'd call it mainstream, or I don't know what you'd call it. You call it. You
Yeah.
know what I'm talking about. You know what I'm talking about. Yeah.
Well, some of the approach to some of these sexual issues really depends on the organization you affiliate with. So, some of the worst outcomes would be with working with sex offenders because the entire approach is just stop it. You should stop it. You can't offend people. You can't offend against children. You can't cross that line. And so everything in the therapy mandated by the courts is just to stop the behaviors. So then the tragedy is that you never address any underlying emotional issues that created those attractions or those feelings. If you look at Dr. Patrick Carn's work with ITAP, the ITAP organization, he's written for years about how the arousal template is developed over time from childhood experiences, from emotional experiences, from psychological dynamics, family dynamics. There's some good research on that. So if you have an offender, for example, and you never address the dynamics that created that template, of course he's always going to struggle his whole life, and all you're ever going to do is tell him to stop it. So other organizations,
Or incarcerate him, separate him from the public so that he doesn't hurt anybody. But
yes,
but that doesn't get to the problem.
no, no, and so really you have someone walking around in misery all the time. Whatever emotional attachment, wounds, deficits, needs they have going on, they're just walking around like a zombie and don't even realize they're like a pressure cooker, and it's always happening, and they're always triggered, and they're always acting out. So you've got to address that. I think some organizations like ITAP do a better job. Also, ASACT with Doug Weiss does a good job of talking about underlying emotional issues. They tend to talk about it more in the realm of pornography or sexual addiction than they do in other aspects of sexuality. And what are some of those root causes? But even then, some of the treatment modalities are just about stopping the use of pornography. And I agree that's good because it's not healthy for you
Right.
psychologically, mentally, spiritually. It's not good. So you do need to stop. But if you never address why it became compulsive, the emotional undercurrents, then it's always going to come back. At some point, you're going to get triggered, and they're going to relapse, and they're going to have some struggles, and it's going to come back. So,
Hmm.
so mainstream is a lot of just stop, and then, but the other side of that coin is that much of mainstream now says don't care. So it doesn't matter. Pornography doesn't matter. Affairs are common. Pornography is not that big a deal. And so the other aspect of worldly counseling and non-biblical advice would be just don't despair over it. Don't worry about it. Try your best, but don't care about it. Well, that's not healthy either. Um, some of the research about what I'm talking about is these are not my ideas. These are things I've learned over 3 decades of working with different people and then other colleagues professionally and other Christian counselors and psychologists and even some of the atheist colleagues I've had that have taught me some of these things. And I just can't understand sometimes why we're not spending more focus, more time publicly talking about the emotional undercurrents that create some of these problems. Because you could the compulsive nature of some of these problems would dissipate if you would focus on it.
And it's odd to me that the fact that many of these behaviors that we're not supposed to be judgmental about, but a compulsive behavior can't be fun. I mean, I don't know how you could think that's healthy or
Yeah,
okay, even if you're not thinking about in moral terms.
yeah,
How can
yeah.
you feel like that's okay? Where would the American Psychological Association stand with something like pornography addiction? I know I'm very familiar, of course, with what they have to say about same-sex attraction and their
Yeah.
views about that and so on. But what do they have to say about pornography addiction or compulsive sexual behavior?
Well, there's a lot of debate going on about that. They're trying to show that it's not a problem, and you have a lot of infighting over that.
Oh,
Whether it's addictive or not addictive. The problem is the
oh,
research every year comes out stronger and stronger, even down to the brain scans. The same areas of the brain that will light up with cocaine use light up with pornography use.
right.
And so, you're seeing some of that. And I think it's getting harder and harder for them to say, no, it's not. And then the ICD, which is the international equivalent of the DSM for the American Psychological Association, has now
Okay.
classified it. Just a year or two ago, they classified compulsive sexual behavior as a problem. So it's starting to move a direction they just can't deny that on some level it becomes highly addictive. And the other thing that also that they're catching up with, Jennifer, is that the way pornography is produced now is not what it was 20 years ago. I mean, teenagers can view in 10 minutes more content and graphic toxic material than I could have seen in 10 years as a teenager.
Right. Right.
And so it's highly, highly addictive. The dopamine spikes, the oxytocin spikes watching pornography are very different than looking at a Playboy or something old fashioned like that.
I see what you mean. So in other words, you can by looking at just the physiology of how people react to it, you can already tell it's more intense. It's not
Yes.
it's not just oh, we're grossed out more. That's not the point.
Right.
That you can really tell that that's true. In some of these interviews that I've done with people who have journeyed away from an LGBT identity, one guy I talked with, he attributed the origins of same-sex attraction for him seeing gay porn when he was 8 years old, and it
Yes.
scrambled his brain. It's like
Mm-hmm.
it disrupted his
Mm-hmm.
development.
Mm-hmm.
And now based on what you're telling me, it probably complicated his ability to attach to people properly,
Yes.
um,
Yes.
in ways that an 8-year-old couldn't sort out
Yeah, I would
by
suggest that
himself.
this particular client, I don't know who it was, but I would probably guess that he was already struggling a little bit. He might have been already
Hmm.
on the edge of struggling with feeling like he had friends or feeling like he was connected to men or his father or feeling masculine, something along those lines. And then the pornography introduced into his mind a new offset, a new way of sort of finding some of that, and it clicked and it moved that way. I've had many clients that way. The teenagers, I run a teenage group for boys who are addicted compulsively using pornography. And I can't tell you now, over the past 5 years, I'll hear them say, Dr. Godfrey, I never was attracted to that. And then I saw this and I couldn't get it out of my head. And then I got more curious. And it is definitely impacting their arousal template and what they're attracted to by simply inserting those images into their mind.
Yes, yes. Let's talk about the concept of an arousal template. People who follow this channel may have heard me converse a bit about this with Andrew Rodriguez, or some of our followers may
Mm.
follow Andrew also,
Yes.
But that's like the sum total of what I know about an arousal template. And my understanding is that it's something that develops. It's not something you're born with, and so yeah, just explain the idea of an arousal template, and we'll see where that takes us.
Yeah. Again, Dr. Carnes is the one who talked about the arousal template. And really, the easiest way to think of it, if I go to my computer and I want to type up a term paper for school and I open my Word document, it defaults to a certain kind of document. And that's what your brain is doing with the arousal template. It's defaulting to the original arousal point. So if you consider that arousal is something that developed, attractions are something that are developed, if you have an emotional pattern first. So maybe if I just illustrate this for you, if we have a young boy and he's not getting any attention at home, dad is always working, maybe mom is not available to him, and he's at school and he starts to become the class clown, and he gets attention that way. And so he creates this pattern, this emotional pattern. He gets attention, being the class clown. It's disruptive, but he does it anyway. Goes home, doesn't get attention. His needs are starved there, so he goes back to get attention at school, being the class clown. If that persists, that's what we would call an emotional pattern. If then you have in this boy's life perhaps an older teenage boy who inserts himself and gives the boy attention, and maybe they start some sex play or something happens inappropriate, the boy molests him, something like that. Now you interject into the dynamic a sexual arousal piece. So the boy's need for attention, for affection, it gets injected with sexual activity in this older boy. And so now his brain is seeing the attention connected to the sexual piece, and they interweave together. And now when he wants attention, he starts to feel sexual and maybe even sexual about this other boy. The more he interacts with this other boy, or when he starts to look at pornography and reinforces that what's now an arousal pattern, it's not just an emotional pattern, now it's an arousal pattern. That imprinting of that arousal pattern, the injection of the sexuality into the emotional piece, is the arousal template. So now what he's originally aroused by is this older teenage boy or a certain activity that becomes sort of his arousal template. It's the thing his brain will default back to as sort of remembering. And the more he memorizes it, the more he repeats it, the more he looks at porn about it, the more imprinted it becomes, the more of a template it is, and the harder it is to change. So sometimes people will come into my office and ask, how do I change this? I want to change my arousal template. Well, it doesn't exactly work like that, because once you've memorized it, your brain memorizes something. How do you unmemorize something? You can definitely allow it to atrophy. You can forget that by focusing on something else, and that would be the goal. So if I'm going to marry my beautiful bride, I'm going to focus on her. I'm going to continue to, be intimate with her and sexual with her and in appropriate ways, and keep that pattern going. The more I do that, the more that imprints, while the other is forgotten and atrophies. You can't really switch one for the other, though. And so an arousal template, very simply put, is the original arousal piece that gets imprinted in your mind, in your brain.
And how does this compare with the concept of sexual orientation?
Yeah, there's some overlap there. I really think that term is going to be retired soon, I hope. The real conflict comes into play because activists would like to convince the scientific community and people at large that you're just born with an arousal template. You're born with this arousal and there's nothing you can do about it. And this is why there's 1,000 genders. You can be this gender or that gender, because no one is born that way. You're not born with an arousal template. The sexual orientation piece is where generally your attractions or your focus, your emotional focus would be. The problem there is that you do have people who have left the gay lifestyle and then they marry into the opposite sex, and and so their orientation clearly has shifted or changed, through therapy, God's grace, things that they may have worked on over their lifespan. So an arousal template is what you're attracted to. A sexual orientation is generally the kinds of people, places, person that you're attracted around. And they would generally say your identity is more around an orientation and how you identify orientation wise versus a
Yes.
specific attraction.
Yes, yes. The identity piece, to me, is the most problematic from a philosophical perspective and from a moral perspective. The idea that this is that who you're attracted to is your identity is a true thing about you, but that doesn't make it central to your identity. And I think a lot
Right.
of the confusion and um, discussion, arguments within the Christian community is on exactly that point, right? Is that can you be a gay Christian? Well, when a lot of the people that I talk with here, they don't like that terminology. They reject that terminology that you're a Christian who happens to experience a certain set of feelings, but that's not your identity.
Yes,
They
yes,
would
yes.
put it that way.
We
Yeah.
did a lot better job in the counseling community back in the 70s and 60s. We knew it was just a fact. You knew that when a boy was sexually abused, that one of the most prominent symptoms of that was his confusion about his sexual orientation and his attractions. Always. And so part of the counseling was, how do you help him identify his identity, that's a feeling he's having because of the abuse, not who he is. And
Hmm.
somehow we strayed away from some of that basic common sense. And instead of telling a child, no, this is who you are, this is you, and you have attractions that have sort of taken things in a confusing direction, but that's not who you are. And you can still pick up books that talk about working with kids who've been sexually abused, and it'll say in the book that confusion is one of the most common symptoms of having been sexually
Yeah.
abused, and we just ignore that. We need to talk about it more with the kids. My opinion, especially from a biblical standpoint and my clinical work over 30 years, if you are biologically a boy, you are wired dynamically to be heterosexual. If you are a girl, you're wired to be heterosexual. You biologically are heterosexual. But it's true, your mind, your feelings, your attractions may be pulled off course because of trauma or different dynamics that have gone on. But that doesn't mean you're not biologically a boy wired to be attracted to other girls and moving that direction. Instead, we're, the left is trying to move towards an identity. Well, if you feel this, you must be that way. If you feel that, you must be that way. And it's just so unhealthy.
Well, and one of the confusions is that there has been this idea that children are sexual from birth. And this is one of the things that Kinsey did give to us, was the idea that children can experience orgasms and children are sexual beings, and all this type of thing. We really have redefined childhood, in my opinion, and this takes us maybe further down the track than you and I want to go today. But I have long felt now that the way in which we've redefined the meaning of human sexuality has had the consequence of redefining what it means to be a child. Because we don't think of children as helpless beings who need their parents. We think of children as autonomous sexual beings who need privacy so they can have sex. This is Wilhelm Reich's idea. This is Kinsey's idea, that kids need their own apartments and this type of thing.
Mhm, mhm,
And this is the United Nations idea, to be
mhm.
honest. This is what the United Nations is promoting. So and that gets parents off the hook, because if parents want to get divorced and remarried and shuffle out the sex partners, the kids will be fine because they don't really care. They don't really need us, as adults. So we've
Yeah.
we've done we've done created a lot of confusion about the whole issue of being a child and developing over time. Here's my theory, not a psychologist, okay, just watching you guys try to figure out your work. Everybody's born, as you say, with a sex, the sex of their body, and with the potential to be attracted to a person of the opposite sex. But this is a developmental task to get from babyhood to mature man or mature woman. That's a task. It has to get done. And it's not automatic. There are things that make it easier that are built into us and stuff, but it can be derailed. And if it gets derailed, your arousal template can go all over the place. Is that roughly correct?
Yes, I would say that's 100% correct. And
Okay.
and that all of the research supports what you just said.
Yeah. Yeah. But do you, well, I don't want to put you on the spot. Well, maybe I should put you on the spot. My colleague, my colleague, Father Paul Sullins,
Mhm,
we're very concerned about this whole issue of counseling freedom. And as you know very well, that there are jurisdictions that are trying to control and regulate what goes on in a therapist's office
yeah.
because they're operating with a certain theory about how people really are, and their
Mhm,
theory is you're born gay and you can't change that. And anybody who tells you that is lying to you and is hurting you,
mhm,
and
mhm,
that's getting written into law, and
mhm,
the
mhm.
fact that some people do change and change successfully and live for a long time with an opposite sex partner and so on and so forth, that we don't want to talk about that.
Mhm.
That's a problem. Um, what do you think is going on with like the mainstream when the American Psychological Association, this is what I'm thinking when I say mainstream, this is what I'm thinking. The American Psychological Association issues these statements about same-sex attraction, gender identity, that type of stuff. Are they aware of this other research that you're talking about arousal templates and compulsive behavior and that kind of stuff? It seems like they have that. Do they even study that? Is it a completely different group of people writing
Yeah,
these one kind of reports and people, working with compulsive sexual behaviors? What's going on there, Floyd?
you know, I would say that there are many who are aware of the research, but there are individuals I think that ignore it. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the committee, the APA subcommittee that decided to address this whole conversion therapy topic, and they created a statement that says we don't know completely what causes sexual or attractions and blah 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 blah. And but conversion therapy is harmful, and they listed a bunch of things. Well, 11 of the 12 of the people on the committee were gay activists. So you have to start to wonder to yourself. This is I'm not sure it's so much as an organizational belief as it is individuals who have a worldview, who have positioned themselves into leadership positions to influence their worldview on everyone around them. I mean, 11 out of 12 people on the committee to write that decision, that that is so absurdly biased. And I know that there are people on the Alliance and other organizations who offered to be on that committee, and they were just turned down. People who would have been objective about it. So I think it's a personal. I think people have personal worldviews, insert themselves into leadership positions for the sake of promoting their own position, moving away from biblical concepts
And science, moving away from
and
science.
science. Yes, yes,
Which, yes, which
mhm.
science and the Bible line up. For those of you who
Absolutely.
haven't gotten the memo, okay.
I I have never seen a good piece of research uh,
That
that
didn't
that didn't line up
didn't
with
line up
biblical
with it.
values and teachings,
Right, right,
which then leads me to believe, from my Christian perspective, that anything God has taught us in the Bible comes from His love to help us be happy, healthy individuals, not because He's punitive. This is don't do
right,
this, don't do that. It's because He's saying to us, I designed you this way. This is the healthiest place for you to be. This is the healthiest choice for you to make. Don't make that choice. You'll be miserable and unhappy. Don't do the big. And those are the commandments. That's everything he says. And yes,
right.
I've never seen any good research that didn't have biblical congruency.
Right, right. And I'm a Roman Catholic, and you probably know that among Roman Catholics, this is a very deep, very old position that truth is one whole thing, and that
Mhm,
if
mhm.
what is revealed through nature, and what is revealed through the Bible and through church tradition, those things all cohere. And if they don't cohere, you made a mistake somewhere.
Yeah.
It's not that God is at odds with Himself in some way.
Right,
That
right.
that doesn't make any sense. So come back next week for the rest of the interview.